All right, let's get started. I am Robin Kelsey. I got so accustomed to saying that I was dean. I'm not dean anymore, but it's the first thing that comes to mind. I'm a professor in the History of Art and Architecture department, and I'm the co-organizer of the Environment Forum at the Mahindra Humanities Center. And the other organizer, Lucien Castaigne-Taylor, is on leave making a film. So he's not with us, but he will be back in the fall. And this forum is so ably supported by Susie Clark, who's the director of the Mahindra Humanities Center, Steve Beal, who's the executive director, Mary McKinnon, who's the person you see going around and making sure everything's working here, Charlotte Whitman, and Julia Corso, and others. So we're just so grateful to the staff of the Mahindra Humanities Center for supporting us. And it's wonderful to see so many friends in the audience this evening. Our guest at the Environment Forum tonight is Elizabeth Kolbert, and the program will flow as follows. After I introduce her, she will read a bit from her most recent book, H is for Hope. Then she and I will converse for a while, and then we will open it up to questions and conversation from the audience. I imagine that Elizabeth Kolbert needs no introduction to this audience, but to be on the safe side, let me say a few words. On the basis of an early career in journalism, attending to metro and state government issues, Ms. Kolbert, for the New York Times, Ms. Kolbert became one of our leading writers on the alarming changes to our planetary home that humanity is swiftly bringing about. For over 2 decades, she has been a staff writer for The New Yorker, and her writing for that publication, which is celebrating its centennial with the current issue, which came in the mailbox yesterday, has led to a series of page-turning and revelatory books, including Field Notes from a Catastrophe, The Sixth Extinction, Under a White Sky, and most recently, H is for Hope. And if you haven't read these books, please get busy. They are extraordinary. And by virtue of how extraordinary they are and how remarkable her reporting is, the literary world has festooned Elizabeth Kolbert with prizes, including a Pulitzer, 2 National Magazine Awards, a Heinz Award, a Guggenheim, et cetera, et cetera. But I won't go on. On this soggy day, please join me in giving Ms. Kolbert a very warm welcome.
Thank you all very much. Thanks you, Robin, for that introduction. Thank you all for coming out on this not so pleasant evening. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, okay. I'm not sure which mic I'm speaking through, but anyway. So I'm just gonna talk do a little talking and a little reading for 20 minutes or so, and then turn things over to a conversation. But I thought I would start with a little background to this book that Robin mentioned, which is my latest book. How did it come to be? And it came to be in part because of, against this backdrop of the Killing Curve. I'm sure everyone in this room has seen the Killing Curve. This is today's reading, 426.56 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. This is our best record of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, taken continuously since 1958 at the Mauna Loa Observatory. And that sawtooth pattern that you see is seasonal. Does everyone know this? Am I telling you what you already know? Okay, it's a seasonal cycle. We're now in the upward part of the cycle because in the northern hemisphere, the trees have dropped their leaves, plants have gone dormant, they're not taking up CO2 for photosynthesis, and there's just more land and more plants in the northern hemisphere. So every winter, CO2 levels go up, northern hemisphere winter, and then in the summer they drop a couple parts per million. As I say, we're now in the up part, And that sawtooth pattern would be there without us, but that upward slope that you see, that's us. So as I said, this has been called the most famous graph in history. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. This is another very famous chart. This is just CO2 emissions over time. And you see how very rapidly they grew over the last 50 or 60 years or so. They've sort of leveled off. They're going up now at a slower rate, but they're still going up. That notch there was the pandemic, when they actually went down by several percentage points for the first time in quite a long time. And this is really key background. This is real background. This is a record of CO2 levels from an ice core, the longest ice core we have, although they've recently just drilled a million-year ice core in Antarctica, but this is the longest one that they've analyzed, 800,000 years. CO2 levels can be extracted from these ice cores. That ice is 800,000 years old at the bottom of the Antarctic ice sheet. And what you're seeing there, the up and down cycles, those are the ice ages, where CO2 goes up and down. And then when you add the Keeling curve on top of that, you see the difference, right? So CO2 levels have never been above 300 parts per million since for at least 800,000 years, and probably a lot longer. This is how we know that. And that's where they are today, up at 4, as we saw, 426. This is just a schematic showing you how the greenhouse effect works. Everyone knows that. You put CO2 up there and you trap more heat. So more of the infrared radiation that the Earth is always giving back up to space because it's taken all that radiation in from the sun. And those two have to balance out. That is sort of our key point here. And the one reason that I show this is because it also shows that there are feedbacks here. So when you heat up the atmosphere, you also put more water vapor into the atmosphere, and water vapor is a key greenhouse gas. So we're adding CO2 and we're also adding water vapor to the atmosphere. And the reason I show you all this as well is that one of the key points, and this is also a key piece of background, is that CO2 is a very long-lived gas. It is going to stay up there. What really matters in the atmosphere is cumulatively how much we put up there, because for all intents and purposes, what we put up there is going to stay up there for a very long time. And scientists have already questioned whether we're going to skip the next ice age 50,000 years from now, owing to CO2 that we have already put up in the atmosphere. So that gives you a sense of the time scales that we're talking about here. And here you are also probably familiar with versions of this graph. What do we need to do? We need to reach net zero. Until we are not putting up any more CO2 than the oceans are taking up or that the vegetation is taking up, the Earth is going to continue to heat up. And this is what we need to do to reach net zero, to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees. We have blown through that. Don't worry about that anymore. To keep them under 2 degrees, we still need very steep cuts in CO2. And even once we get to net zero, I should point out, we're still going to be melting the ice caps. That takes a long time. There's a lot of inertia in that system. It takes a long time to do that. So we could stabilize the temperature, but we would not actually stabilize the climate. And this brings me to one last bit of background. That is Joe Biden signing the Inflation Reduction Act in the summer of 2022. So this was the first major piece of climate change legislation, not called climate change legislation because we can't talk about climate change even in 2022, even with a Democratic majority in both houses. And this was our first attempt to really actually make a serious effort to bring down our emissions in the US. And this is what the Inflation Reduction Act was supposed to do. There were ranges. They were supposed to bring our emissions down sort of almost in line with our commitment under the Paris Agreement, which we can talk about later if people are interested in. But we were not going to get there even with the Inflation Reduction Act, but we were going to sort of aim in that direction. Okay, so all of that is the backdrop. And then the question is, and this book was written sort of in the aftermath of the Inflation Reduction Act. I would never, call a book Ages for Hope now. But I was interested in which of these narratives is should we be telling. There's so many different narratives associated with climate change. You could tell a million, it's like the city has 8 million stories, climate change has 8 million stories. How do you tell a story? Any one story that you tell can't possibly get at the whole story. And I was really grappling with this after having written about climate change forever and felt like I had sort of hit a dead end. And I thought, well, I would like to try to tell a kaleidoscope of stories, and came up with this idea, not a terribly original idea, of doing an ABC. And I was extremely lucky because this guy, Svante Arrhenius, was the person who, on some level, quote unquote, discovered climate change. And so that was a good A letter to begin with. And that made me think, okay, well, maybe we can do an ABC here. And I'm just going to read a couple of the entries here. And I'm going to start with A and see how long that takes. Okay. Svante Arrhenius was, by nature, an optimist. He believed that science should and could be accessible to all. In 1891, he got his first teaching job at an experimental university in Stockholm called the Högskola. That same year, he founded the Stockholm Physics Society, which met every other Saturday evening. For a fee of 1 Swedish crown, anyone could join. Among the society's earliest members was a Högskola student named Sophia Rudbeck, who was described by a contemporary as an excellent chemist and also a ravishing beauty. Arrhenius began writing her poetry, and soon the two were wed. Physics Society meetings consisted of lectures on the latest scientific developments, many delivered by Arrhenius himself. These were followed by discussions that often lasted well into the night. The topics ranged widely from aeronautics to volcanology. The Society devoted several sessions to considering the instruments that would be needed by Solomon August André, another early member of the group who had decided to try to reach the North Pole via balloon. Whatever the quality of his instruments, André's voyage would result in his own death and the death of his two companions. A question that particularly interested the Physics Society was the origin of the ice ages. All over Sweden lay signs of the glaciers that had, for vast stretches of time, buried the country. Rocks with parallel scrapings, strange, sinuous piles of gravel, huge boulders that had been transported far from their source. But what had caused the great ice sheets to descend, carrying all before them? And then what had caused them to retreat, allowing the rivers to flow once again and the forests to return? In 1893, the Society debated various theories that had been proposed, including one linking the ice ages to slight variations in the Earth's orbit. The following year, Arrhenius came up with a different, and he thought, better idea: carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, he knew, had curious heat-trapping properties. In the atmosphere, it allowed visible light to pass through, but it absorbed the longer wave radiation that the Earth was constantly emitting to space. What if, Arrhenius speculated, the amount of CO2 in the air had varied? Could that explain the glacier's ebb and flow? The math involved in testing this theory went far beyond what was possible at the time. Arrhenius didn't have a calculator, let alone a computer. He lacked crucial information about which wavelengths exactly CO2 absorbs. The climate system, meanwhile, is immensely complicated, with feedback loops nestled within feedback loops. Arrhenius, who would later win a Nobel Prize for an unrelated discovery, plunged ahead anyway. On Christmas Eve, 1894, he began constructing a climate model, the world's first. He assembled temperature data from around the globe and made ingenious use of a set of measurements that had been taken a decade earlier by an American astronomer, Samuel Pierpont Langley. Arrhenius performed thousands of computations, perhaps tens of thousands, and often labored over this task for 14 hours a day. He was still calculating away as his marriage fell apart. In September of 1895, Rudbeck moved out. In November, without having seen Arrhenius again, she gave birth to their son. The following month, Arrhenius finished his work. I should certainly not have undertaken these tedious calculations if an extraordinary interest had not been connected with them, he wrote. Arrhenius believed he had unraveled the mystery of the ice ages, a riddle that had, quote, his own quote, hitherto proved most difficult to interpret. He was at least partly right. Ice ages are the product of a complex interplay of forces, including wobbles in the Earth's orbit and changes in atmospheric CO2. His model turned out to have another use as well. All across Europe and North America, coal was being shoveled into furnaces that were bellowing out carbon dioxide. By thickening the atmospheric blanket that warmed the Earth, humans must, Arrhenius reasoned, be altering the climate. He calculated that if the amount of carbon dioxide in the air were to double, then global temperatures would rise between 3 and 4 degrees Celsius. A few quadrillion computations later, vastly more advanced climate models predict that doubling CO2 will push temperatures up between 2.5 and 4 degrees C, meaning that Arrhenius's pen and paper estimate was, to an uncanny degree, on target. Arrhenius thought that the future he had conjured would be delightful. Our descendants, he predicted, would live happier lives under a warmer sky. The prospect was, in any event, distant. Doubling atmospheric CO2 would, he reckoned, take humanity 3,000 years. It's now easy to poke fun at Arrhenius for his sunniness. The doubling threshold could be reached within decades, and the results of this are apt to be disastrous. But who among us is really any different? Here we all are, watching things fall apart, and yet, deep down, we don't believe it. So that's A. I'm not going to, I realize that I don't want to take up too much time. I'm just going to read actually one more entry, because this was also, an alphabet is hard only when you reach letters that are difficult. But fortunately for me, xenophobia begins with an X. So that was actually also pretty easy. So I'm just going to read X, and then we'll just talk about whatever you all would like to talk about. Okay, so xenophobia. One of climate change's many compounding injustices is that the highest costs will be borne by those who have contributed the least to the problem. Several low-lying island nations, including Tuvalu and Kiribati, are destined simply to disappear. In Bangladesh, some 2,000 people arrive every day in the capital, Dhaka, many driven by storms or rising seas that have made village life unbearable. In Pakistan, in 2022, flooding caused by supercharged monsoon rains killed 1,000 people and forced 600,000 more into relief camps. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has estimated that globally, an average of 21 million people are being displaced by weather-related events every year. The UN's International Organization for Migration has projected that by 2050, as many as 1 billion people may be on the move. In the coming decades, huge populations will need to seek new homes, Gaia Vince, a British journalist, has written. Either you will be among them, or you will be receiving them. Almost as much as climate change itself, this great displacement will test national and international institutions. One possibility is that climate refugees will be welcomed. This could happen because it's the right thing to do, or it could happen for less high-minded reasons. As Akko Ramon, a former foreign secretary of Kiribati, has observed, countries like Australia need workers, while the citizens of countries such as Kiribati will soon need a different place to live. These needs are complementary. The EU, too, faces a labor shortage. A communiqué issued recently by the European Commission noted that there's this, quote, strong economic case for allowing in more legal immigrants, especially since the, quote, transition to a climate-neutral economy will require additional labor and new skills. Climate migrants could play a key role in decarbonization, providing a new kind of win-win narrative. Another possibility is that climate migrants, like millions of migrants before them, will be despised. Rich countries, including those in the EU, will try to keep refugees out, and those who manage to slip in will be herded into camps. In an effort to gain power, right-wing politicians will vilify them, and this will encourage yet more racism and xenophobia, a social feedback loop. Giorgia Meloni, Italy's prime minister, has said that her country ought to, quote, repatriate the migrants back to their countries and then sink the boats that rescued them. Both the effort to limit climate change by replacing the world's energy systems and the effort to adapt to climate change by erecting dikes and seawalls will take place in the context of climate change, which is to say, as cyclones, drought, fire, and sea level rise force millions of people to flee. It is possible that cascading crises will accomplish what 3 decades of climate negotiations have not, and unite the world to seek the best way forward. Or it's possible that the same forces that have prevented cooperation in the past, nationalism, corporatism, sectarianism, fear, will, under the stress of climate change, only intensify. Okay, I'm going to end on that happy, cheery note and turn things over to Robin.
Thank you. I will say that it was very interesting to hear your description of why you produced H's for Hope. And I think it's highly successful insofar as what you described as no single narrative will suffice is exactly how I experienced the book. In fact, the image that came to mind when I read the book is of this flying creature that's looking where to land. And, you know, maybe it's going to land on despair. D is for despair, but no, despair is unproductive. So then we go over and, you know, maybe electric planes. F is for flight, or these cinder blocks made out of the slag from steel production where there's CO2 injected in them. Maybe that's going to help, you know. G is for green concrete. But then O is for objection. You know, that's not going to be enough. And, you know, I felt this way that there's this movement across these different narratives. And I was struck by the fact that you said that you wouldn't have a book now that is called H is for Hope. I'm hoping it wouldn't be D is for despair. But I wondered if you could say a little more about your thinking about these narratives and that kind of restless movement among them. And let me just also say, for me, it's a matter of the heart as well as the mind. In other words, there's such a need to orient ourselves in the face of this evidence. And I found it very helpful as you took me through those different narratives.
Well, thank you. You know, I really wanted to, you know, why I wouldn't call a book H is for Hope now is because it's, I don't have to tell anyone in this room, you know, it's not a very hopeful moment when you're, you know, dismantling every possible, you know, when you're scratching climate change out of grant applications. And I mean, so that was a more hopeful moment. And, you know, the problem, and so my goal was to sort of lay out, you know, both the case for hope, and in fact, one of the chapters actually takes place right near here. It was a startup. It's actually an interesting story. It was a startup, Form Energy. Has anyone heard of Form Energy? Yeah, right nearby. Some MIT people trying to do these big, what are called iron air batteries, to do long-term storage. If you have intermittent, you know, wind power, solar power, you need a lot of storage. And, you know, the batteries that we use in your tape recorder or in your phone, that's just not going to cut it. So you need this huge amount of energy storage. So they came up with this, and, you know, near here, right near here in Somerville, I guess, and in an old wine warehouse, they were testing these batteries. And that's one of the chapters. And that is actually H is for Hope. That's a chapter about hope. And they actually, since I visited them, they are actually building a plant in West Virginia with Inflation Reduction Act money. But what is going to happen now, I really don't know. I need to call them and find out what where things stand, because that factory was being constructed last time I talked to them. So I wanted to really, you know, both lay out the case for hope, but as I sort of also suggested in the, you know, just the numbers that I laid out at the beginning, it's sort of, unfortunately, hope is kind of too easy, you know, when you're against this backdrop of what it will actually take to, bring us to net zero. It's not enough to, it's like that plastic straw or whatever, that's not going to do it. And even iron air batteries are not going to do it. It's massive. It's unbelievably massive. It's the entire infrastructure of this country. It's the entire infrastructure of, Harvard has to be re-engineered. And everything that we do has to be rethought. And there's not a lot of willingness to do that, even in the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a very positive development, but it still wasn't rethinking things from the ground up and, wasn't going to get us to where we needed to go. So I really wanted to lay out both of those facts. They're both facts that those were, there was a lot of exciting, great stuff going on, and there was this much bigger picture that is very hard to get the numbers to work out. And how do you convey that?
So it is clearly a very difficult moment to find hope. And I suspect in this regard, I suspect that many, if not everyone in this room is feeling that. I'm glad that you got the book out with its title, though.
Yeah,
I appreciate it.
Too late, yeah.
And let me say that I find in your work an invitation to a form and degree of self-honesty, which, if not hopeful, is nonetheless has within it a counteraction of hopelessness, insofar as there is this invitation to be honest with ourselves. And you're very good at puncturing the forms of magical thinking to which we are prone. I wonder if we're hitting up against the limits of a certain human willingness for that kind of self-honesty. I mean, sometimes, there's been moments where it's felt like, oh, if people only understood the science. And then there's other moments when you think about, the vested interests. And here I'm thinking about all the different narratives one can tell for our inability to grapple with the situation. And one of the things I thought about when I was reading the book is it just too hard for us? I mean, it's not just an inconvenient truth, right? It's a devastating truth.
Yeah, climate change has been called, a super wicked problem. It is a super wicked problem for a variety of reasons. Like if you wanted to think of the kind of problem that people would have a very hard time solving, it would be, a sort of slow-moving, cumulative, global disaster where it's not in anyone's particular interest to solve it or to deal with it, and it's in everyone's interest to try, hope for the best, hope that something comes along to save us from ourselves, really. And it's an intergenerational problem. I think that cannot be overstated. We are leaving this problem to our children and our grandchildren, and as that chart about the next missing ice age, forever. We are leaving this legacy to all the generations we could possibly imagine waiting to be born. And that is, I don't think you could say humanity has ever dealt with a problem like that. Now, you could say there are many problems like that modernity has introduced, where we, forever chemical is another, form of leaving a legacy, for forever, as they say. But climate change is up there as a problem designed to foil us, I think. And we are sort of, as it were, falling into that. And I am still, I'm not surprised that we haven't solved it, because it's very difficult to solve. In fact, you can't solve it. It doesn't really have a solution at this point. It only has degrees of bad or worse. But I am surprised, even I am surprised, at how we could now be, scrubbing mentions of climate change from government websites as, LA burns down, as, the last hurricane season, as many coastal cities, and Boston is among them, are going to be experiencing, are already experiencing, sunny day flooding. All of these things, exactly what was predicted, is all now coming true, and we don't seem to be able to even acknowledge that. And I have to say, I am surprised by that part.
Well, one thing that strikes me is we're seeing so much technological ingenuity of certain forms, and in some ways, an interesting degree of confidence on the part of some who are pursuing these technologies, but so little experimentation of a kind of social kind, right? I mean, one of the things that occurred to me today in reading your work is in a way, it feels like capitalism is now what nature used to be. It's like the given background. It's the source of all generation, and so how, in your investigations, in all that you've done, in the remarkable travels, the people you've talked to, are there indications of the ways in which we could rethink the way that we live in the world to address these problems?
Well, C is for capitalism, so we
I didn't know that.
we do take that on for not at any great level of detail or originality, but the argument, the question, the great $64 trillion question of whether you can solve this problem in a capitalist economy, world basically, the entire world is basically a capitalist economy, an interconnected capitalist economy at this point, where you're depending on growth, where growth is the sort of given, right? We have to grow, we're going to grow, continue to grow. Now, if you're going to continue to grow, you could say, well, we're going to continue to grow, but we're going to, use less energy. We're going to get more efficient. We're going to use less energy. But when you actually interrogate that quite closely, once again, it's really hard to keep producing more stuff, physical stuff, and bring your using essentially, less and less energy. Now, the good news, I will say the good news, and I'm sure there are a lot of people in this room are much more expert at this than I am. EE is for electrify everything. If we did electrify everything, we would need a lot less energy because it's just much more efficient way to use energy. An electric car is just using energy a lot more efficiently. And so I think that, the question of whether there are other ways to live with 8 billion people on the planet, many of whom aspire to live the way we do. We are extraordinary hogs. I mean, Americans are just way, way up there on the consumption index. Whether it is possible to raise the standards of living for billions of people who have not experienced the standard of living that we have, and at the same time, bring your emissions down to net zero. Once again, we're not even trying, so we're not trying to answer that question under the current system. Obviously, people would say you need to put the right capitalist incentives in there, and you would see a lot of motion. And I do believe that that is true, but it's unclear whether you can, whether that circle can be fully squared. I don't know the answer. We should certainly be trying, but we're not even trying. And whether there's another economic system, that's way above my pay grade. I'm going to be frank. I don't know.
So, yeah, well, above all of our pay grades, I'm sure. I want to talk to you a bit about your role as a writer. Because one of the things that I find extraordinary about your writing, and I will say too, when I saw this book on the shelves of Porter Square Books, I thought, oh, this is kind of a kid's simplification, A is for Apple. And it is very succinct and it's very graphically vibrant, but it's a serious book. And I learned from it and I highly recommend it. As a writer, you've had an extraordinary gift for entangling matters of the heart with the cognitive matters around, for me, the cognitive issues at stake in climate change and in extinction and other environmental challenges. And I wonder if you could say a little bit, as a writer, how you draw the reader in. It was really fun to reread and read your work and think about the way you practice as a writer. And I wonder if you could say a little more about bringing the reader in, especially because it's such difficult material that you're asking people to metabolize.
Yeah. Well, I don't have any particular, most of what I write ends up in the New Yorker. I mean, those two books, Under White Sky, and the Sixth Extinction began as a New Yorker piece, and Under White Sky sort of began as a New Yorker piece. But they're, the tricks of the trade. I mean, there are other journalists in this room. They all know the tricks. You try to go out into the world, introduce people to. I mean, I would say one of the unusual, burdens of writing about climate change or any environmental topic these days is that your readers don't actually want to read about it. So that is, that's not like a lot of stories. It's not like the latest movie. It's not like a celebrity profile. It's like, I know people would actually prefer not to hear this. So how am I going to sort of, circumvent those defenses? And I think that has to be by, usually taking you someplace interesting or, an interesting character. So I myself have a huge carbon footprint. I travel a lot for these stories. In an effort to, draw you in some way, not just say, we're completely screwed over, but, take you along on a journey somehow. That's usually, and introduce you to something a part of the world you didn't know, a story that you haven't heard before.
You do this little sprinkling of humor, which you use very well, and you also have these marvelously specific extraneous details, like the kind of cream-filled tart in Paris, and then that covered hammock in Panama, and the bag of Tostitos when you're going up to Prudhoe Bay that your driver throws, and those are all inserted in such a surgical way, and often you carry them through in this wonderful way. So I wonder if you could say, maybe or maybe not, you have anything to comment about that. But also the other thing that I'm interested in is the construction of the first person. You're very inconspicuous in your writing, but it seems also, again, very, very deliberate the way that you introduce your own sort of agency within the story. I wonder if you could say something about that.
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, I began at the New York Times, where first person was, verboten. You never could write in the first person. And then I went to work in the New Yorker, and it was actually, it was very difficult to to learn a whole new set of skills. Storytelling is very different if you're working for a newspaper or a magazine. But the great liberating thing was to be able to say I, and that really can get you out of, what are you trying to do when you're telling a story? Once again, this is sort of shop talk a little bit, but you're basically, your goal, what is your goal? Well, your goal is to keep people reading. That is your goal. If they haven't read the story, it hasn't really accomplished anything. So, the I can appear at moments where you feel you need it. That's what it's like. It's like break glass when necessary. You need some connection. You need some aside. You need some something funny, something that wakes them up a little bit and keeps them reading. But that's really all. There's no. I don't have a formula or I couldn't articulate it, but I think that I appear. I sometimes appear because something has happened that to me that, was memorable to me, and I hope will strike a chord, like you mentioned, sleeping in this like coffin-like hammock, which was absolutely horrible
Yeah, I
experience.
couldn't understand that, by the way. I'm a claustrophobe,
I'm a claustrophobe too.
Yeah, passage. For me.
If you're in a rainforest, you can't just sleep out in a hammock. The hammock has to have a top, otherwise you're going to get poured on. And it was absolutely. I'm also claustrophobic, and it was absolutely a horrible experience, like one of the worst nights of my life. So
I'm so glad I bring this back to mind, yeah.
So sometimes it's just things that like made a big impression on me, and I hope that they might make an impression on you too. And sometimes it's, as I say, it's something you need something. You need a moment, and the only way that I have at that moment of providing it is in the first person. But it's very handy. Most pieces in the New Yorker have probably some little long reported pieces have an eye that's probably fairly similar to the eye. It's not an original construction by any stretch of the imagination.
So this is also kind of inside baseball, but this is a humanities-centered forum, right? So talking about writing, I think is appropriate. But our Harvard colleague Jill Lepore, in this new centennial issue of the New Yorker, which came in the mail, I don't know, yesterday, she has this wonderful piece about the relationship between writers and editors over the history of the New Yorker. And I just wonder, given that you worked, for the Times, and then you've worked so long for the New Yorker, if you have any reflections that you could share on the role of editing. And
yeah, well, it's funny because Jill got in touch with me for that piece because I haven't read it yet. I haven't gotten my magazine yet.
It comes
Postal
faster,
Service,
yeah. To Cambridge than Williamstown,
yeah. Because my editor for a long time was a wonderful guy named John Bennett, who was a real sort of survivor of the New Yorker. He was like the only person he'd been there under. He'd started under Sean, and he had survived all these editors. And he was a great old curmudgeonly editor. And she asked me, did I have any old emails from him that would, sort of, anyway, be good for a story. And I sent her a couple, but I don't think they were good enough. But he was very taciturn too. So his emails were like, okay, we'll talk tomorrow. But that relationship is, it's a dying art. I mean, unfortunately, it's like, people, John McPhee writes about his editor, and has anyone read draft number 4? Yeah, it's if you're interested in the craft of journalism, it's a great book. And he talks about, he talks about bringing William Shawn this piece on oranges. Has anyone read John McPhee's Oranges? Like 50,000 words on oranges, which he had, which Sean wanted to cut down to like 4,000 words. And he talks about renegotiating that up to like, 47,000 words or whatever. so that's an interesting, yeah, that's it. But I don't have any, great like sort of tales to tell. But I do think it's a very special relationship, and people used to have at the New Yorker a closing meeting, and everyone would sit around a table with, printouts and scribbles, and that has sort of, once again, because people aren't in the office and all that just sort of ended and disappeared. So it's not quite the same, as it used to be. But your editor kind of has to get you, or if they don't get you, you should try to find a new editor, because there can be a lot of tension as well.
Yeah. So you have described in your writing how opportunistic you have been in terms of someone invites you somewhere and you go, and you point out often that it's to a certain extent arbitrary, that you could have done the story from any number of different points or followed the fate of any number of different species. are there particular people you want to be talking to now? Like, is your focus shifting as a result of what's going on in the world, or just the trajectory of your own work?
Well, I mean,
because you got people here who are very, very connected, so maybe they,
Yeah, no, I often come here to talk to people. Absolutely. I mean, well, I'll tell you, I'm worried for the people here, and I'm worried for myself, to be honest. I mean, I go out with people who have planned, big expeditions. They need a lot of funding. They're often being funded by the NSF. I don't know what's going to happen. And there used to be I don't know, I'm sure there are scientists in this room, but there's a component on NSF grants, like how are you going to communicate with the public? And so I was often the beneficiary of that. Like, I was the tag along who could, communicate with the public. But since, God knows where that NSF funding is going, so I'm always looking for, I'm often looking for people who are going out into the field who are, that sort of gets back to this idea that you need to sort of take people somewhere. And also these, concepts that can be pretty dry, in a scientific paper, I try to, sort of bring them to life somehow. And that's often working scientists, once again, not an original trick, but an oldie but goodie, is getting out there and actually seeing what people are doing and watching them, count the, little bugs that they're, taking out of the, pupfish, pool and things like that. To actually watch that happening, it's not good for, a whole piece, but it's a great little scene there. And that's really what you're trying to do, is connect as many of those as you can, once again, to keep people reading.
All right. I think we should open it up for people's questions. Yes.
Thank you so much for all of your work.
I just had a question. Given the state of politics, given the state of from local, national, international, how much do you look to technological solutions, from which you've written about in your last book, Under White Sky, in terms of carbon sequestration, geoengineering, but perhaps now, since there have been some significant advancements, of nuclear fusion being something of a way out?
Well, I think that, we've proved on some level, that we're not, what are the two options to radically cut back on our consumption, or to find technologies that allow us to, keep consuming but reduce our carbon footprint. Now, the problem here, getting back to capitalism, is you could potentially reduce your carbon footprint, but as long as you're, still mowing down the rainforest, let's say, or I guess that's increasing your carbon footprint. But as long as you're still destroying the natural world and for the materials you need or whatever, that won't change, the sixth extinction, but it might change the trajectory of climate change. So I guess I think we are, if there's any way that we're going to minimize the impacts of climate change, it's going to be through technologies that become more and more efficient and cost less and less. And we are seeing that. And what you could argue what we're seeing right now is the last spasm of the old order desperately trying to prevent these new technologies from taking over, because they see, electric cars mean, the end of gasoline. Well, that's a really big blow if you're an oil company. So I think that, what's going on is so awful in that respect. It's this phenomenon that people call lock-in, right? So you're trying to just, put the oil wells in the ground, as many as you can, while you can. And then you have to amortize that investment. You make it much more difficult to transition. And I think that, but other countries will move ahead. They will move ahead. And maybe one day we will see nuclear fusion. There's that old joke, it's the technology of the future. It always will be. I am not enough of an expert to know whether any of the hype surrounding right here in Cambridge, Mass, whether any of it is for real or not. I guess I would say I'll believe it when I see it. How's that? Or I won't see it, but I'll believe it when they start generating power.
Yeah. Oh, right. I'm supposed to request that people wait until the mic comes.
Hi. How do you explain the different approach towards climate change in the European Union and the United States? And I ask that question because there's a tradition in this country for movements being able to bring about change at the political level, going back to slavery, civil rights movement. And we've seen in the beginning of this century, Bill McKibben, 360, even Al Gore and Fridays for Future, Greta Thunberg, who has had a tremendous influence here in the United States. But we haven't seen any policy implications to speak of, except with the exception of the Biden administration. Whereas in European Union, we saw the same pressure for movements, but now it is climate policy is part and parcel of any government, of any planning for the future in Europe. In this country, it's up and down. You never know where it's going. How do you explain that different approach?
Well, I don't have a great explanation. I would offer a couple of points, one of which is that, we're a huge fossil fuel producer. It's an economic vested interest. Where are the vested interests in this country? And I really do commend the EU has always taken the lead. I mean, since in 1992, the Framework Convention on Climate Change was, submitted at Rio. We're now 30 years later. We're going to have another big climate conference, which will be presumably a mess because of what's happening in the world. And in Brazil again, they're going back to Brazil in this fall. But it was the European Union that wanted, hard targets, enforceable results, and it was George W. Bush who said, well, not George W., George H.W., who said, we're not doing that. Nothing will interfere with the American way of life. And I think that has been our attitude. This is, we've always consumed. The Europeans are high consumers, but we consume twice as much, and we have lived in a certain way. We have no mass transit, all the things that make it really, really hard to cut your emissions suddenly, or even not even suddenly, but even, over a reasonable amount of time. We've just continued to live in certain ways that are really very difficult to bring into line with any climate policy. And you can never say to the American people, actually, gas prices should be higher. That's not, you want to die politically? That's how to do it. And so I think it is just built into the sort of way we live. And, even friends of mine who are, fairly climate conscious will complain about high gas prices. I'm like, what? So I think that that's just, it's so fundamental to American life. And I think that's a big part of it, but I can't swear to that. How's that?
Why has the movement lost momentum?
Well, because I think that is because, why is it? I don't know. I'll ask people why. I mean, part of it is because there wasn't enough to show for it. It was not a happy thing to be involved in. And we're a country that likes happy things too. So it's a slog. It's everything is going to be a fight. Every tiny little victory is going to be a huge fight. So I think people were just like, I'm going to either get involved in something else maybe that has more chance of success, or I give up. I don't really know the answer to that. I'd be happy if someone wants to address it in the audience, because I am really depressed and upset. I mean, I don't see it as I don't see young people, on the streets. And if there's an issue that young people should be upset about, it's this one. I don't know if anyone wants to take that up, any of the young people in the room.
Other questions? This one here.
Yeah, so I'm going to express this as an opinion and ask for you to react. First of all, I think it's the price of eggs in answer to your question.
The price
to
of
the
eggs.
Audience. It's a lot of self-interest. What's my ability to buy a house? What can I get? I mean, it's very easy to lose sight.
But people in Europe presumably have self-interest too. So, yeah.
But the observation I've had is that there's a certain strain of technology, particularly in data science, that has, I'll just describe it as incredibly arrogant, that we can get our way out of anything. And I don't think that strain of people, and I see a lot of them, it's almost a generational thing. It's a certain generation, certain type of innovator, technology person. They're so not proximate to the lives of people, to the reality, especially of underserved populations, to the reality of people living in low resource areas of the world, that their optimism is with blinders on it. And I just wonder, when you talk to people in technology who have potential solutions, you'll believe it when you see it. Do you see that arrogance and we can invent our way out of everything, or am I just imagining?
No, I think that there's a big strain of that. And, there's a big, look, we are still here, right? So there's also a big strain of, you guys are, it was the population bomb, it was this, it was that, we're going to run out of food, we're going to, we're all still here. There are more people than ever before, and living higher standards and living at higher standards of life, globally. And, on average, many people are not, obviously, and living longer lives. And so, you doom mongers, you've always been that way. And we technologists, we've always come up, we came up with fertilizer when we were going to run out of, food. And we've always invented some new way of doing something. And we'll get out of this too. And one of the, important points I think to make to these people is the way you can't get out of this problem, right? You're not getting rid of climate change. And that's why we have, we'll suck all this carbon out of the air. And that was sort of the last under white sky. Well, that's extremely difficult to do, just energetically. The physics of it are really, really bad. And so are we going to go to geoengineering? That's the ultimate technological solution, right? We're not going, it's not fusion, we're going to spray, particulate matter in the stratosphere, and that's going to block incoming radiation, and that is going to, balance out climate change. And that is the sort of ace in the hole for the, for the real technological crowd. And that is that's never going away, because, the problem is just going to get worse and worse. And so we're always going to have that. Well, that's our ace in the hole, There's just a paper that came out, just a paper ripping through that, but it's never going to go away until we start doing it, I suppose.
Other questions? Yes, please. One right here.
Who is it?
Yeah, if you could keep your hand up until Mary brings the mic over, she'll be happy.
Thank you. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you mentioned how in Europe, was it a prime minister that say that they refused to take in refugees who are like seeking help? So I question, and that you said that it's those who are at the lower half that will suffer the most and not the ones at the very top. So with that taken into consideration, do you think that developed countries will be more proactive in terms of receiving refugees from climate crisis, or would you foresee them with being developing countries being able to take into these refugees?
Well, I mean, if you look at what we're doing as a model developed country, we're going to, try to kick every refugee out that we possibly can, I guess. I see a tremendous, anti-immigrant politics fueling, politics not just in the US, but increasingly in Europe. And no, those are not all climate refugees, but in many cases, there's probably a climate strand in there. So I see, I do not see us heading, in the quote unquote right direction. What developing countries are going to do when there are mass migrations, and there's going to be mass internal migration, and there's going to be mass cross-border migration, and how that's going to play out. I'm certainly no expert, but I think there's going to be, tons of problems. I mean, people generally don't like it when lots of people move into, their own, what they consider to be their part of the world. So I don't necessarily think that the developing world will handle this with any more, generosity and mercy than the developed world. I don't see why they should, honestly, but I don't know that. It's possible that they will. It's possible. I don't know the answer to that.
Do you think it would exacerbate the effects of climate change there's only a finite number of resources and there's so many people?
Well, I guess that's the ultimate question that we're dancing around. Are there only a finite number of resources, right? Or are we always going to conjure up, more resources? That is sort of the, and I think I'm sort of an old school type who thinks there are, the only people who think there can be, there's a famous quote from the 70s, an economist, a great character, the only people who think there can be infinite growth on a finite planet are madmen and economists. And that I kind of hold with that, but there's the technological strain that says we've never run out of resources, and we haven't run out of resources yet. We always find new places to find them. We're going to dig them up from the bottom of the sea. There are actually a lot of resources on planet Earth, it turns out, if you're willing to go get them. So I think the question is an open one. We're in the process of answering it, as it were, but I don't have the answer.
Well, and I would just mention something that you've said in your writings is pointing out that even a solution that is going to somehow sustain human populations is not necessarily going to preserve the biodiversity that we may want or need.
No, absolutely.
There's a question up here. Yes. Here comes the mic.
Hi. I love your books. I have not read H is for Hope yet. And I was just thinking, what question could I ask you? And a year ago, I went diving in Florida with my brother off the coast of Miami. And it was like a graveyard down there, a coral graveyard. And I don't really know how to manage that feeling sometimes. So you're very aware of these problems. How do you still find beauty and joy in places that are losing that?
Well, that is a really good, that's a good question to which I do not have a good answer. I want to say one of the ironies of writing The Sixth Extinction was I got to go to some of the most spectacular places, including pretty intact parts of the Great Barrier Reef. And it was the most extraordinary experience. But I do feel increasingly, and I don't know whether it's a function of age or the world, that everywhere I go, I just see, Aldo Leopold has this famous quote, I think it's the price of an environmental education is that you live in a world of wounds. And I do see, maybe I know more, or maybe but I just, everywhere I go, I see, and I wouldn't want to go diving off of Florida because it would just be too depressing. And I don't dive. So I definitely wouldn't want to go diving. But I mean, like going to the Caribbean and these reefs that I know are destroyed, it's so depressing. I can't say that I have some like magic formula here, but there definitely is, still beauty in this great world of ours. I mean, right there, even we know that these were imported from Colombia at great, carbon cost. Terry Tempest Williams has this book, Finding Beauty in a Broken World, and I think that, I think about that often, that idea, like, how do you find beauty in a broken world? And, people are capable of amazing things and amazingly beautiful creations too, and we're also capable of, terrible destruction. So I do think it's really important to find some, I don't want to call it hope, but to find some thing that you find, things every day, something that you find gives you some sense that the world is a beautiful place still, because otherwise it's just too awful. Yeah.
I love that question, because I do find that one aspect of reading your work is not only to be enlightened about the situation that we're in, but also to feel that someone is with me, and that voice that you create that draws us in, and we're with you, and with you as you sort out all these different narratives and their emotional valences. I think is just a really important service that you're performing for many of us. Other questions? There's one over here.
Thank you. Do you think, so I'm kind of the mind that a lot, like the climate crisis is probably as a result of, Western countries and their emphasis on individualism, that every person is just, a self-autonomous, like monad that just exists in the world, that everyone's an island. And if that's the case, do you think that in order to address the climate crisis, we would have to investigate, or we would have to interrogate and critique our understanding of the self, that comes as a result of the liberal tradition that the West cherishes?
Well, that's a really good question. And, also I'm going to say, above my pay grade. But I certainly have, also thought, one of the problems, obviously, also if you want to, use the word capitalism or individualism, or, is that we have constructed ourselves here in the US and maybe much of the Western world as consumers, right? So that is one construction of the self. Now, could you have an alternative, construction of selfhood that would be much less destructive? I would think that you could, but I do also want to say that societies that have, emphasized collectivism, have been, the Soviet Union was a terribly polluting, greenhouse gas emitting country, so I don't know that the two are, I just don't know. And I do think, another thing that is dismaying, and we're in a sort of environmental humanities, is the kind of thinking that, we don't seem to be interested even in different ways of living or different, has there been any sort of political thought of how we might live that either bears any resemblance to, that captures people's imagination, since, Karl Marx? I don't really know, but it seems like we're in some kind of, hole here that we can't get out of. Maybe, and I don't have that philosophy myself, but we could use it. So something for you to think about.
I see a question here. We'll take a couple more and then we'll call.
Thank you. Two quick questions. Are you familiar with the natural step in Sweden?
I'm sorry, the natural.
The natural step? So it's probably 25 years old, but I think it's still alive. And it was an effort by, and I can't remember his name, it was a scientist that saw all the disagreements and all the different people thinking different ways about climate change and the consequences. And he started a program to interview all these scientists that were had differences, and came up with a system of, can we agree on 5 core things? So what can we agree on instead of what do we disagree on? And it was quite successful in that it changed industries in Sweden. I think the king sent every citizen a video back when they had VCRs, a video of the program. But anyway, for me, it's a point of light to say, can we find the things we agree on to start making progress?
Yeah, that we could certainly use that today.
Yeah. Anyway, it's called the natural step. And the second question is, I'm assuming that Al Gore got burned out on his quest. Are there any current politicians or people with some power that are really carrying a banner?
For climate change? Well, I would say, there's no one who's out there like Al Gore was. But our own Ed Markey is a climate leader in the Senate. I would say, some of the senators from the Pacific Northwest, and Jay Inslee was the governor of Washington State. He was definitely, that was his signature issue, and he ran briefly for president. On that, didn't get very far. But I think it does get a little bit to just the sense of, burnout or like that's not the issue of the day. I mean, that's the problem with climate change. It's always going to be an issue, never going to be going away. But that's not the way that, even American politics works. We're like on to a new issue, I don't see anything. I don't see anyone emerging in the near future because there's so much now to deal with.
With that, I think we will call it one last question. Please, go ahead.
Well, speaking of leaders, when I'm in a group of young people like this, and I especially want to come back to your question, you who swam off the coast of Miami, because I think we may have a future leader here who's going to graduate and be that key messenger. And I'm over at the Kennedy School. We had an event today on Arctic and the melting of the Greenland ice sheet. And I think 2 key points to remember were that for the Arctic, every 10th of a degree counts. And so the future is not yet written. It is a lot of changes totally baked into the system, but it's not hopeless. And really, we do have to change the way that we think about how we relate to nature, how we consume, how we use the planet. But I really do think that, and there's massive corporate interests, and all of those things are true. But still, each person, I think, can do something, and then you see the beauty when you are helping, whether it's protect a little bit of habitat or just noticing the nature around you and doing what you can. But on the bigger scale, the future is not yet written, and I think that's so important to remember from scientists who are looking at every single degree and how that will change in the Arctic.
Thank you. And on that uplifting note, let's call it an evening. Thank you so much. Thank you.